We're going to spend the next 4 weeks talking about specific kinds of property that you can manage. We've already done some of that, and you've already looked at some of those things for your assignments. Chapter 10 has to do with residential property, which is the most common kind of management that most people tend to be involved with. Whether you're an individual investor or managing property for a small company, for your own company or someone else, it does tend to be very common. There are also a lot of multifamily apartments and buildings like that. Some of them have a residential manager on site, and you may or may not be as involved with those. This chapter reviews a lot of the concepts that we've already talked about, so it's kind of a good review. It's a summation of what we've been learning all semester. They talk about a little bit in the chapter about how you can compare various kinds of properties. So if you're trying to establish a rental price, for example, there's a chart in the book that shows how you can list the various features of a particular property and then compare it to other properties and add and subtract prices or rent based on those factors. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this class. It's very specific. The real estate agents do some of this too when they're trying to figure out pricing for properties for sale or what's a good value for a purchase. They have a similar process that they use, and I think it requires a little bit more experience and expertise than what we would be likely to have in a beginning property management class. It's presented here for your information. I'd like for you to understand how it works so that if you see it, you'll know what it means and how it was derived, but we aren't going to spend any time on actually calculating these costs and these rent increases and decreases. There's a specific section on marketing the residential property and also leasing. Again, we've talked about this somewhat in the past, but there are a couple different kinds of leases mentioned. There's a periodic lease and a lease for a term. A lease for a term basically just means that it's for a year or a specific period of time in the lease. 6 months or a year is most common for a residential lease. A periodic lease means that you maybe are renting month to month. Maybe you've been on a lease and your lease has expired and you've chosen to stay over. A lot of leases say that if you stay past the end of your lease term, that you will be on a month-to-month basis and you will continue on until someone gives notice that they're leaving. And that would be a periodic lease. Leases like that don't have to be in writing, but my mantra is if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And if you want to have some protection as a tenant or a landlord, it's always a good idea to have a lease in writing. You do have a little more flexibility if you can get out at 30 days notice, for example, rather than being committed to finishing out a lease term. If you're signing a lease with somebody and it's for a year and the person abandons the property 3 months into the lease, you're out 9 months of rent that they're technically obligated to pay you. Likewise, if you are the tenant and you abandon a lease early before the term expires, you are legally liable to pay that rent for the balance of the lease term. The landlord is obligated, if you're the landlord and someone moves out early, you are obligated to try to mitigate your damages by re-renting the property. And then you're limited to just collecting the difference between what you would have gotten if the person had stayed and the new rent. But if you're the tenant and you leave early, even though the landlord has a duty to try to mitigate his damages, you can still be on the hook for a significant amount of money. Just something to think about when you're signing a lease and wanting to leave. If you have conversations with your landlord or with a tenant, if you are the landlord, you always want to make sure that you memorialize those in writing. If it involves an agreement of any kind, you might want to have signatures on those and dates so that it's clear that the parties have agreed to it. Many courts have now extended the written component of a court case. For example, was it in writing? They will accept an email as proof of that very often now, or a text message for that matter. Even having a text message from your landlord is considered a writing, so that's something you might want to consider and keep those things handy. if you have concerns or issues. There is a really good example of, and it's a very detailed example of a walkthrough list in your textbook. We talked about this at the beginning of the semester. When you're getting ready to rent out a property to somebody, you want to walk through the property with them and have them look and see what condition the property's in. You want to keep very detailed records of what that property looks like and if there's any damage to it. Of course, if you're the landlord, you want to keep it in good repair, but sometimes there are little things that, it's just not worth it to fix, and then you'll just make a note of it so you won't be concerned when that person moves out and you won't think that that person should be held responsible for it. Sometimes I've been in this situation. The landlord has given me the paper and said, you have 3 days to examine the property and write down everything you see that's wrong with it and turn this paper back to me. That's a nice way to do it too. And then you have some time when you're not under the gun to do the walkthrough and kind of examine, see if there's, too many holes in the wall or a big ding out of a wall or a hole somewhere that you don't want to get charged for later on. What I have seen some property managers do in Boise, I think it's an excellent idea. There are some things that always seem to be a problem at the end of a lease. The burner pans on the stove, for example, or a towel bar, or a toilet paper holder, something's broken, or a light fixture, or a lot of light bulbs are missing or broken. They actually have a price sheet that they add to their walkthrough list that tells the tenant exactly how much they will be charged for each item that's missing or broken at the end of the lease period. A burner pan might be $5. So if you move out and you leave the burner pans all crusted with gunk, you can know you're going to pay $20 for 4 burner pans. I think that's kind of a nice way to do it because it tells people what the expectations are, and then you're not surprised at the end. I've also seen a lot of leases that specifically require the person moving out to have the carpets professionally cleaned and provide a receipt, or to have the unit entirely professionally cleaned and provide a receipt. Or failing that, there's just going to be a cleaning fee charged at the end. The landlord just assumes you're not going to leave it pristine, and we're just going to charge you a cleaning fee at the end so you don't have to worry about it, and that way we'll have it clean to our standards when you leave, when you're busy moving. That's a great way to handle it too. If you have that all spelled out in writing for a tenant, it makes it a lot easier at the end when someone wants to argue with you about it. Oh, my sister-in-law has a cleaning business and she cleaned it for me and it was immaculate, I swear, but she's not a professional cleaning person, or maybe she is and you didn't give them the receipt, so you have a leg to stand on if you have to try to retain some of the security deposit for cleaning or whatever purpose. But I suggest if you're interested in renting out property on your own or for someone else that you have a very detailed walkthrough list like this. Pet policies are something that's discussed. I think we've kind of beaten the service animal thing to death, although again, companion animals and service animals are a huge deal these days. Huge. Even more than they were 10 years ago. You can hardly go anywhere without, people can buy a service animal vest on the internet and say, my dog's a service animal, or my porcupine, or my, whatever, goldfish. It's a service animal. I saw a thing on TV where there was a lady that had a pig on the airplane and she said it was her companion animal. So, everybody's different strokes for different folks. So you want to make sure that you have a pet policy and also that you know what the rules are for service and companion animals so that you are sure to follow those, and that you have a script, as Steve Fender said early on in the course in his interview. If you have a specific script that you always stick to every time, then you won't have to worry about you or your employees saying the wrong thing. And finally, when somebody wants to move out or you have to throw them out, then you have your paperwork all in a row to be able to return their security deposit. If you would take another look at the Attorney General's pamphlet that I posted online, you have 21 days to return the security deposit and give an accounting to a tenant. Up to 30 days by agreement in the lease, but no longer than 30 days. If it doesn't say so in the lease how long you have, then you get 21 days. It's not very long to get over there and do a walkthrough and arrange for cleaning and all that. Just something to keep in mind. You kind of have to be Johnny on the spot. And if you have to throw someone out, we talked a little bit in the past about eviction court and some of those kind of things. Again, you don't have to put up with someone who's preparing or growing illegal drugs in your unit or your home that you're renting out. A big thing that has come to light lately is people using their houses for grow operations for marijuana. Now, in some states, that seems to be perfectly fine, but it's just not okay in Idaho, and I don't see that it's going to be okay in Idaho for quite a while. If you're the landlord and you notice weird things going on in a property, like all the windows are blacked out in part of the house and you don't ever see any light coming out of them, if you do a drive-by, if you notice the electric bill is sky high for a property, that often indicates that someone's growing marijuana inside the house. They've taped off the windows so that you can't see inside, and they have these very bright lights to grow the marijuana inside. The grow lights that consume a ton of electricity. And this has been in Canada, if you have had a house that you own that was used for a marijuana growing operation, you have to disclose that to any future owners or future tenants, because it's considered in Canada almost as bad as a meth lab. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but we're not in Canada, so it doesn't really matter. I just threw that out there for a little bit of a interesting tidbit of information. But this is getting to be a big deal around the country now that some of the states have decriminalized marijuana. And by the way, marijuana is not legal in any state. Some states have decriminalized it, meaning they are not going to prosecute violations for marijuana. It is a Schedule I narcotic. The United States has treaties with other countries where they have all agreed that they will treat that as a Schedule I narcotic, and it is not allowed, and there is a federal law considering it a controlled substance. Just in case you want to have an argument with somebody about it being legal somewhere, it's not. But that's okay. Another little piece of trivia that you might be interested in knowing. And that's one reason that you're allowed to evict someone who's smoking marijuana on your property. I will tell you, in some states it's getting to be a little bit of an issue with the medical marijuana. If that ever comes to Idaho, then things might change, because medical marijuana, if it's not being smoked, some states have said that you're required to allow people to consume edibles or things like that as long as they're not being smoked, if you have a no smoking policy. One thing you might also want to consider is whether you have a no smoking policy for your properties, because that does preclude some things later on down the road, but that's up to you, because my husband smokes and a lot of people smoke, and he always goes outside, but maybe you don't want to, and maybe you don't care if people smoke, so that's up to you, but it's just something else to think about having in your lease. There are a couple of kinds of specialized residential housing we're not going to talk about either, and one of those is subsidized housing, sometimes called Section 8, where you get a tax benefit from the government for renting to low-income folks. There are very many specialized requirements for that, federal law, and we're not even going to begin to touch that. Or if you're managing an over 55 community, someone my age, you're allowed to discriminate on an age basis for over 55 if you have, if it's primarily for people that are of that age group, you can say no children. But that's one of the rare exceptions to the fair housing laws. And again, very specialized rules for that. So it's not super common that you have an outside management company handle those, and we're not going to get into that. The subsidized housing, it is a lot more common, and so if that's something you end up deciding to do or work for someone that does that, then that's kind of a unique set of federal oversight requirements that you'll need to look into.